subject of this book review is Digital Games as History, How Video Games Represent the Past and Offer Access to Historical Practice by Adam Chapman, which was published in 2016. In keeping with the theme of the second module of this course, the book examines digital games as a historical form under the premise of three guiding questions. 1. How can we approach these historical games as scholars interested in them? 2. How do they represent the past? And 3. What opportunities do they offer players in terms of actively engaging with history and historical practice? Through the answers to these three questions, Chapman forwards the argument that the chosen form which conveys history is incredibly important. To that end, he also advocates for a serious consideration of digital historical games as a legitimate historical form because of their nature and historical potential, but also because of their status in popular culture. Chapman pursues these arguments by articulating three aims for his book. First, he offers a framework for analysis of historical games by highlighting 5 core elements common in all of historical games. They are simulation and epistemology, time, space, narrative, and affordance. Second, describing the nature of historical representation in games. And third, determining the practical use of games as a system of history. Chapman's work focuses mostly on the theme of interplay between these elements. Essentially, he explores the ramifications on a game when it chooses to operate, for example, under a realist or structuralist simulation style, how it treats the flow of time within the game, the openness of space available to the player, or whether the game affords agency to the player in an open-world game rather than strictly adhering to a narrative. Indeed, these three elements that Chapman develops in depth illustrate how games enfranchise people to create their own history in history play spaces, as he terms them, how they allow for reenactment and participation unlike any other media, and while allowing for the player to be the audience and creator at the same time. Another major theme of Chapman's book is tension. He looks at tension between historical resonance and player motivation to create historical narrative through challenging gameplay and rule sets. The tension in between balancing a historical narrative and gameplay, as well as the inherent tension in the relationship between developer, historian, and player in general. As a whole, I find Chapman's arguments very convincing. He makes it clear that his argument is not that games should not replace other traditional historical forms, but that they can work in concert with written history. I think one of the strengths of the book rests in its commitment to the form of video games in general. This allows Chapman to draw examples from multiple games instead of analyzing the historical usefulness of a single game. Another strength would be his in-depth analysis of game elements so that the reader understands how different aspects of a game impacts historical representation. The book highlights the decision-making process for the developer historian in manufacturing history, and thereby adds substance to and expands the standard argument for the game as a historical form beyond the simple engagement, participation, and visualization of the player. Some of the points I found to be particularly moving included the comparison he drew between games and history as both being able to display multiple interpretations of historical discourse, and that they have similar limitations as a form, such as external influences like the editorial process, or physical limitations such as the length of the work. Also, that the larger scale access to games can lead to training of the player base in skills necessary for historical activity, such as the production of counterfactual history. It also forces players to consider multiple viewpoints in a structured environment. However, a prominent weakness I saw in the book was that Chapman did little to balance his own arguments. Specifically, he did little to acknowledge the drawbacks of games as history, beyond acknowledging that sometimes narrative sacrifices must be made for the sake of gameplay and entertainment value. I believe that he glossed over an important part of the game's appeal to its audience and how it impacts the history within. I'm talking, of course, of the commercial aspect of gaming. He leaves it mostly for the player or reader to determine which games are the most historically valuable by focusing on form rather than individual games. He also acknowledges that people's perceptions of history are perhaps unintentionally shaped by games, but does not address the fact that a potentially large swath of players do not interact with history games as a form of history at all. In terms of evidence, he blends personal experience, examples of games, and secondary academic sources effectively to support his argument. He even acknowledges the limited amount of scholarship on this topic and therefore draws on relevant similarities between historical games and historical film for further support. Again, though, a more thorough engagement with and counter to arguments against his position would have been beneficial. In terms of his book's relevance to our game project, I feel that Chapman reflects many of the decisions we have had to make through the development of our own representations of history. We have decided to embrace discrete time, a structuralist simulation, and a structured gameplay system with limited player agency within the rules of gameplay. We feel that this allows us to present history in a way that allows the player to enter a fictional scenario loosely based on historical events, and to differentiate between authentic and fake historical sources through puzzle mechanics. We believe that this will allow the player to engage in a critical history while being able to translate the core lesson of evaluating sources to other historical endeavors. Much as Chapman suggests that video games may act as a training mechanism and gateway for players interested in history.